The wind carried whispers through the tall baobab trees, their thick, ancient trunks standing as silent witnesses to the turning of time. Beyond the rolling green hills, the mighty River Lulama flowed, its waters shimmering under the golden sun. The people of Nyamura believed the river was alive, that it sang to those who listened, whispering the stories of their ancestors. It was a kingdom blessed by the gods, a land where cattle grazed upon endless fields and the drums of celebration were heard under the stars. Farmers tilled the rich soil, mothers wove fine cloths, and warriors sharpened their spears, ever watchful of threats beyond the borders. Yet, for all its beauty and prosperity, a shadow lay hidden beneath the surface. It did not march upon the land like invading armies, nor did it come like a storm across the plains. It slithered in silence, waiting, watching. The people laughed and danced, unaware that change was already upon them. The great baobabs knew, for they had seen such darkness before. Seated upon his high throne of carved ebony, King Okuru watched over his people. The years had etched lines upon his noble face, and though his body remained strong, his heart carried a heavy weight. The kingdom he had ruled for 3 decades flourished, yet one question tormented him. Who would sit upon the throne when his time was done? His eldest son, Jabari, was a warrior of great skill, a leader the people admired. But leadership required more than strength. It demanded wisdom, patience, and the ability to see beyond one's own desires. At his side, his trusted advisor, Kweku, spoke softly. "My king, the people grow restless. They whisper in the markets. They ask when you will name your heir." Okuru exhaled slowly, eyes drifting toward the distant mountains. A king must not be hasty in choosing his successor, Kweku. The fate of Nyamura is too great a burden to place upon unsteady shoulders. But in that moment, he did not see the gleam in Kweku's eyes, the subtle smile that came not from concern, but from something far darker. Jabari rode his horse through the fields, his spear strapped across his back. He had led many hunts and battles, yet none of his victories seemed to bring him closer to what he truly wanted, his father's trust. He passed through the village, where children waved and called his name, their laughter carried by the wind. But the warriors, the elders, the merchants, they all looked at him with expectation. "The prince will rule us soon," one man whispered. "If the king names him heir," another replied. That single word, "if," hung over him like a storm cloud. That night, as the fires flickered in the great hall, Jabari stood before his father. "I have fought for Nyamura, bled for it. Why do you hesitate to name me as your heir?" King Okuru studied his son for a long moment before answering. "Because strength alone does not make a king, my son. Patience, wisdom, and humility, these things take time." Jabari's heart clenched, though he bowed and left in silence. But as he turned, he did not notice the shadow in the corner, the one who had been listening. Kweku. In the dim corridors of the palace, Kweku moved like a serpent. He had served the king faithfully for years, but faithfulness was not power, and power was what he craved. Nyamura did not need a king bound by caution. It needed a ruler willing to take what was his without hesitation. As he passed through the halls, he smiled to himself. The time was near. All he needed to do was push a little harder. Beyond the palace walls, deep in the forests where the elders dared not tread, Izana the seer sat upon a bed of old bones and dried herbs. His eyes had seen too much. His ears had heard the whispers of the wind, and his lips had spoken of things men feared. Tonight, the fire spoke of darkness moving through the kingdom. Izana lifted his wrinkled hands to the sky. The river sings, the trees whisper, and yet they do not listen. His eyes glowed like embers in the night. They never listen. The night of the Festival of Ancestors arrived, and all of Nyamura rejoiced beneath the open sky. Drummers pounded rhythms older than the kingdom itself. Dancers moved with the spirits of those who came before them, and storytellers wove tales that had been passed down for generations. Fires burned high, illuminating faces filled with joy and laughter. But the wind had changed. Izana felt it first. As the drums quieted, Izana stepped forward, his cloak of woven reeds rustling with each step. The people fell silent, for they knew what it meant when the seer spoke. His voice, low and deep, carried across the festival grounds. A shadow walks among you. Murmurs spread. Some laughed nervously, others frowned. When the sacred moon turns red, betrayal will be sealed with blood. A hush fell upon the gathering. Izana's eyes locked onto King Okuru's, and for the first time in years, the great king felt fear. An old man's riddles, someone scoffed. Izana speaks in madness, another said. But the king did not move. Why? Do you say this, seer? Okuru finally asked. Izana only shook his head. Watch before it gets deleted from your hearts, for what you see will change everything. As the festival continued, Kweku found Jabari standing alone, watching his father from afar. Your father doubts you, Kweku said smoothly. Jabari tensed but did not answer. Why else does he not name you his heir? Jabari turned sharply. He waits for the right time, Kweku chuckled. Or perhaps, he waits for another. A chill ran down Jabari's spine. As the night deepened, the stars watched in silence. Somewhere in the darkness, the first betrayal had begun. The sacred moon would soon turn red, and nothing would ever be the same. The evening sun cast long shadows over the great walls of Nyamura's palace, the golden light stretching across the land like a lingering farewell. Inside the grand hall, Prince Jabari sat in silence, staring at the intricate carvings on the wooden floor. His heart was restless. He had always believed he would rule after his father, King Okuru. He had trained since childhood, led the warriors in battle, and earned the people's admiration. Yet his father had not named him as heir. A quiet footstep broke his thoughts. Why do you sit in the shadows, my prince? Came the familiar voice of Kweku, the king's advisor. Jabari exhaled sharply. Does my father see me as unworthy? Kweku stepped closer, his voice smooth as silk. The people speak, my prince. They wonder why the king delays, why he hesitates, and there are whispers that he favors another. Jabari turned sharply. Another? Kweku nodded. Your cousin, Tunde. Jabari's fists clenched. Tunde, the younger cousin who spoke softly, who smiled at the people, who never held a spear but always held their ears. Could it be true? A ruler must be loved by his people, Kweku continued, his voice a gentle poison. And your father? Well, perhaps he believes Tunde is better suited for such love. Jabari felt a burning in his chest, his father's words from many moons ago echoing in his mind. A true king must be wise, patient, humble. Had those words meant he was not ready, or worse, that he was not worthy? That night, Jabari did not eat. He did not sleep. A storm brewed within him, and when the morning came, he was no longer silent. Inside the royal court, in front of elders, warriors, and councilmen, Jabari stood tall, his voice sharp with accusation. My father, you have ruled wisely, but why do you keep the people in uncertainty? Do you not trust your own son to take your place? Gasps rippled through the chamber. King Okuru's face darkened, but he did not raise his voice. Jabari, he said, firmly, a throne is not a gift to be taken, but a burden to be earned. Jabari's jaw tightened, his heart beat loud in his ears. Then tell me, father, have I not earned it? The king met his son's gaze, but his answer did not come swiftly. And in that moment, the seed planted by Kweku took root. The night air was thick with the scent of burning oil lamps, their flames flickering against the stone walls. Kweku moved like a shadow, unseen, yet always present. In a dimly lit chamber, 5 councilmen sat before him, their faces hidden beneath the hoods of tradition. "The king is growing weak," Kweku whispered. "He cannot decide, and Nyamura suffers for it. The people grow uncertain, and uncertainty brings weakness. If we do not act, the kingdom will fall into the hands of the wrong man." A murmur spread between them. Men of power did not fear battle, they feared losing control. "Jabari is strong," one of them said hesitantly. Kweku smiled, the firelight glinting in his sharp eyes. "He is not just strong, he is the rightful king. But he cannot see that yet." Outside the chamber, hidden in the shadows, Jabari listened. His heart thundered in his chest. "The throne is his by destiny," Kweku continued, his voice weaving a trap of words. "But King Okuru is blind to it. He waits for Tunde, for a man who cannot lead warriors, who cannot command the land. Is that the future we want?" Jabari's fists clenched. He had heard enough. That night, he sought out Kweku in private. The torches burned low, and the night carried no wind. "Tell me the truth, Kweku." The advisor bowed his head, feigning sorrow. "My prince, you are already a king. But your father, he no longer sees it." Jabari's heart burned with a mix of anger and certainty. "Then I will make him see." The sacred moon rose red, just as Izana the seer had foretold. The palace corridors, usually bathed in golden torchlight, felt strangely cold, the air thick with something unseen. The guards stood alert, yet the silence around them was unnatural. Within the king's chamber, Okuru sat alone, deep in thought. The weight of leadership hung upon him, heavier than it ever had. A soft sound, a whisper of movement. The king's instincts, honed by years of battle, screamed danger. His eyes darted to the doorway just as a shadow slipped inside, a glint of metal, a dagger, raised high. "Traitor!" A voice rang through the chamber as the door burst open. Izana, the seer, stood. There, his old frame bent but his eyes fierce. Guards stormed in, weapons drawn. The assassin hesitated, then turned to flee. From outside, chaos erupted. Swords clashed, men shouted, and the once peaceful palace became a battlefield. In the confusion, Kweku disappeared. Betrayal had shattered him. Jabari stood before the royal court, his face pale, his heart thundering. "You have conspired against your own father," Okuru said, his voice thick with sorrow. Jabari swallowed hard. "I only wanted what was mine." Silence. "What is truly yours, my son?" Okuru's voice was tired now. "A throne? A kingdom? Or the respect of your people?" Jabari's breath hitched. For the first time, he saw the depth of his mistake. The king's gaze hardened. "You are no longer a prince of Nyamura." The words cut deeper than any blade. Stripped of his title, Jabari walked alone beyond the palace gates, the weight of exile upon him. Somewhere in the distance, Kweku watched from the shadows, unseen, but never gone. The wind howled across the vast Kalahari desert, whipping up golden dust as the sun set behind jagged cliffs. Jabari, once a prince, now walked alone, his once proud robes now tattered, his sandals worn thin. Hunger gnawed at his belly, and the weight of regret sat heavy on his shoulders. He had been cast out, stripped of title and home, forced to wander as a nameless man. One evening, after days of wandering, he stumbled into a small nomadic village, its people wrapped in flowing robes, their faces covered against the desert winds. He collapsed at their feet, exhausted and broken. A strong hand lifted him. "You are far from home, stranger," an elder with a silver beard said, his eyes sharp. With wisdom. "I have no home," Jabari murmured. The elder nodded. Then perhaps you will find one here." And so, Jabari lived among them, tending cattle, fetching water, learning to live not as a prince, but as a man. For the first time, he knew hardship. One day, as he struggled to lift a heavy water jar, a woman from the village laughed. "A prince's hands are soft, but here we do not carry crowns. We carry burdens." Her words stung, but Jabari said nothing. That night, he lay beneath the stars, staring at the vast sky. The choices he had made played over in his mind. The whispers of Kweku, the anger in his father's eyes, the moment he chose ambition over wisdom. Had he truly been blind? An elder sat beside him, his weathered face unreadable. "The past is a fire, my son. Let it burn away your doubt." Jabari remained silent, but the fire in his heart was already beginning to change. The years passed, and Jabari grew stronger. He learned to hunt, to listen to the desert, to live humbly. But the past never truly left him. Then came the whispers. Trader from the north brought news to the village one evening, his voice heavy with sorrow. "Nyamura suffers." Jabari's heart pounded. The new king bleeds the people dry. Crops wither, taxes rise, and those who speak against him disappear. He needed no further words. He knew who the traitor spoke of. Kweku had taken the throne. The next morning, he set out alone. The winds carried him toward home. The Nyamura he returned to was not the Nyamura he had left. Villages stood in ruins, the marketplace silent. Children no longer played in the streets. Where once stood proud warriors, now stood soldiers with cold, unfeeling eyes, and the palace, his father's palace, was now a fortress. He knew he could not walk in openly. Disguised in tattered robes, he moved through the streets, listening, watching. "Kweku rules with iron hands," a woman whispered to her neighbor. "The people are starving," said another. He clenched his fists. It was time to act. His path led him to Izana, the seer, the man whose warnings had once been ignored. The old prophet sat in the ruins of a temple, watching the sky. "So, the prodigal son returns," Izana murmured without turning. Jabari knelt. "I was blind, but I see now. Tell me, seer, can I set things right?" Izana's gaze was piercing. "The past is a fire," he said again. "Let it burn away your doubt." Jabari nodded. It was time to fight. The moon shone bright as Jabari stood at the head of his army. Not a grand army, not soldiers of war, but men and women who had suffered, who had lost everything under Kweku's rule. They carried spears, farming tools, whatever they could find. "Tonight, we take back our land," Jabari declared, his voice steady. "Tonight, Nyamura rises." The warriors raised their weapons, the sound of their battle cry echoing into the night. The gates of the palace loomed ahead. The first arrow flew. The battle began. Swords clashed, shields shattered, men fell. The streets filled with the sound of war, with the cries of the wounded, the shouts of the vengeful. Inside the palace, Kweku stood at his throne, watching the flames rise from the city. "Fools!" he sneered, but his sneer faltered when the doors burst open. Jabari entered. Their eyes met. No words were needed. Blades sang as they clashed, the weight of betrayal, anger, and destiny behind each strike. Kweku fought like a cornered beast. But Jabari fought like a man who had already lost everything and was ready to reclaim it. The final blow came swift. Jabari's blade pressed against Kweku's throat. But he did not kill him. The city was silent. The people, bruised and weary, gathered before the palace, staring at the man who had once ruled them with fear. Jabari looked at them, then at Kweku. "I will not decide your fate," he said. "You will." Kweku's eyes widened. "You would let them judge me?" Jabari nodded, and so the people spoke. "Exile him," cried an elder. "Let him wander as we have," called another. The decision was made. Kweku was cast out, his power stripped, a man without a home, just as Jabari once had been. The kingdom was free. That night, Jabari stood atop the palace walls, watching the fires die down. Izana appeared beside. "Him!" "And now?" Jabari asked. Izana smiled. "Now, my son, you rule." Jabari exhaled, the weight of his past finally lifting. The lost prince had become a king. The square before Nyamura's palace was filled with people. They stood shoulder to shoulder, whispering among themselves, their voices like the rustling of dry leaves. The great city, once silenced by fear, now trembled with anticipation. The fate of a traitor was to be decided. Kweku, once the king's most trusted advisor, knelt in the dust, his robes tattered, his face streaked with the sweat of a man who had lost everything. No crown, no soldiers, no power. Jabari stood before him, tall and resolute, his once proud face now tempered by wisdom. His gaze did not burn with anger, but with something deeper, understanding. The elders of the council stepped forward, their faces etched with the weight of duty. The eldest among them raised a hand. "Kweku, once you walked these streets as a man of wisdom, whispering in the ears of kings. Now you stand before us, broken and alone. Do you have anything to say?" Kweku lifted his head slowly. The fire that had once burned in his eyes was gone. "I did only what I believed was right," he said, his voice hoarse. "Is it wrong to seek power when one is more fit to rule?" The crowd murmured in anger. Men had died because of him. Children had starved. Jabari raised a hand, silencing them. "You were my father's most trusted man, Kweku," he said. "Yet you sought to take what was never yours. You turned brother against brother. You drowned Nyamura in suffering." Kweku lowered his gaze. For the first time, he had no words. The elder spoke again. "By the laws of Nyamura, you have lost the right to call this land your home." A gasp rippled through the crowd. "You will walk the earth as a man with no people, no kingdom, and no name." The people watched as Kweku was stripped of all symbols of status, his fine robes torn from him, his feet left bare against the scorching earth. The city gates opened, and, without another word, Kweku walked out, alone. Behind him, Nyamura sighed in relief. The weight of betrayal had been lifted. As the sun dipped below the mountains, Jabari walked the long path to the royal chambers. The halls of the palace were quiet now, the echoes of battle fading into memory. The scars of war remained, but hope lingered in the air. At the foot of his father's throne, Jabari knelt. King Okuru, aged and weary, looked down at his son. The last time they had stood like this, Jabari had been filled with arrogance and defiance. Now, there was only humility. "Father," Jabari said softly, "I have seen the world beyond these walls. I have known hunger, pain, and regret. I have walked among the people, not as a prince, but as a man. And now I return, not to demand my place, but to ask for your forgiveness." The old king sighed, his tired eyes glistening. "A father's heart does not forget pain easily, my son. But neither does it forget love." He stepped down from his throne, placing a firm hand on Jabari's shoulder. "You left here a boy who thought the throne was his birthright. You return as a man who has earned it." The court fell silent as the king lifted his staff. A true king is not chosen by birth, but by his journey. With slow reverence, he passed the royal staff to Jabari. The people erupted into cheers. The kingdom did not welcome a returning prince. It welcomed a king. As the celebration continued, Izana, the old seer, sat upon a stone near the palace steps, watching the flames of the festival fires dance against the night sky. A young boy approached him, eyes wide with curiosity. "Is it over now?" the boy asked. Izana chuckled, shaking his head. Nothing ever ends, my child. The river flows, the sun sets, and history turns like a great wheel. But there is always a lesson to learn. The boy sat at his feet, eager to listen. Betrayal may bring gain for a moment, Izana said, his voice like the wind weaving through the trees. But it only plants the seeds of regret. The path to true wisdom is not in taking power, but in earning it. And justice is not about vengeance, but about setting things right. The child thought for a moment before asking, "And what happens if people forget?" Izana smiled, his eyes glowing faintly beneath the firelight. "Then history will repeat itself, my son. It always does." As the night deepened, the fire crackled low. The people of Nyamura, once divided, sat together as one. Their laughter, their voices, their unity, this was the true victory. Izana rose to his feet, his old bones creaking, and turned toward the people. "This changes everything," he said, his voice echoing through the quiet night. "Watch before it. Gets deleted from your memory, for what you see will shape what is to come." The people listened. The tale of betrayal and redemption would not be forgotten. And as time moved forward, fathers would tell their sons, mothers would tell their daughters, and elders would remind the young, so the cycle would never begin again. The story would live on.